Hello and welcome to Let's Talk Leadership. With me today is Jane Millar, an international executive coach working with several leading business schools and leadership organizations, as well as with her own clients. Jane is highly experienced in the use of psychometric tests in coaching and in team development, and she's a particular specialist in the Myers-Briggs type indicator, also known as MBTI. Today, Jane is going to talk to us about 360 feedback as a leadership tool. Welcome, Jane.
Nice to be with you, Britt.
Nice to have you here. Jane, many people at some point in their career do a 360 survey, but what is it exactly?
Well, a 360 survey is basically a feedback tool designed to find out how people are doing. And it's called 360 because the idea is to ask a range of other people in the organization. So not just your boss, who you'd expect to get feedback from anyway, but also the people who work for you and your colleagues, your peers and other people that you interact with, so that you get a picture that it coming from all parts of the organization. And it consists of a series of kind of behavioural statements, which the people you've asked to rate you are asked to rate according you on a particular scale. So, for example, 1 to 5. And an example of a behavioural statement might be something like delegates appropriately and trusts people to deliver. And your raters will be, if they think you do this really well, will give you a 4 or even a 5. And if they think you're really not so good at this, that or not yet, they'll give you probably a 2. Rarely a 1, but it happens. And if they think you do it to a certain extent, they'll probably give you a 3. So a series of behavioural statements and prompting answers from a whole range of respondents in your organisation.
Right. How many raters do people typically choose?
Well, it makes sense to have a reasonable sample. So I would say at least 12, maybe 15 would be a good sample, but you could have more if you want. And the other thing I didn't mention that is worth saying is that it isn't only about numerical detail, quantitative data. There's usually, not always, but there's usually a section in which people are invited to make comments, usually in response to questions like, what does this person do particularly well? So it's more open for them, and maybe what could this person do better, improve on, concentrate on developing, etc. So there is also a space in which people can, in a confidential space, give some free-form answers as well as the answers that have been selected according to the type of survey, which is designed usually either by the company itself or by a specialist organisation. And this point about confidentiality is really important because you don't know who the responses are coming from. Sometimes you know if it's your boss, sometimes the survey is designed so that the boss is identified, but you won't know who else has replied, although you will sometimes have it sorted into kind of rater categories, like you'll know if the responses are coming from your direct reports or your peers or somebody senior to you in the organisation.
Right. So it's partly anonymous as well for your raters.
Yes, it is largely anonymous. And so that gives you some neutral information in a way, and it also gives the raters confidence to pass any messages that they want to pass, knowing that they won't be sort of put on the spot and asked to explain what they meant by something.
Right. And the output of this survey is usually in the form of a report, which is confidential, right? It's just for the person who did it.
And it's a report, but we have to remember it's really a report in the form of a sort of photograph of a moment in time. It's how people see you at a particular moment. And this report should be debriefed by a coach, either an internal coach from the company or an external coach, so that you're not left sitting there wondering what on earth it means. And the idea is not to sort of show it to other people usually, but to maybe encourage people to share the outputs of it.
Right. So what are the reasons why people do a 360?
Well, it's often part of an organisational development initiative that the company or organisation is doing, maybe in conjunction with a business school or a training company. But it might also just be part of the internal HR processes of a company. Many companies have their own 360, which they offer regularly as part of their sort of good practice. And so it varies how often people do 360s and how familiar they are with the experience.
Right. And especially when they do it for the first time, in your experience, how do people typically react when they get this report back?
Well, if it's the first time they do it, it's often a surprise in the sense that there might be a blind spot revealed that they hadn't really been aware of. Not necessarily a blind spot in a negative sense. It could be that they just didn't know they were doing something particularly well. And so the first time is usually a very impactful experience. After that, it tends to be less of a surprise, but it's always good to have a fresh look at how you're doing, and particularly if you're in a new role. And it's different from other feedback in the sense that it's processed in this particular way, and it's also a benchmark because the information is presented in relation to a comparison group. So the information is presented in relation to, say, well, it's always other people who have filled in the report, but it might be people within your company, or it might be people, a more external benchmark of managers, say a group of middle managers outside your organisation who have all filled in the same report. And it also is always around a set of competencies. Usually there are individual behavioural statements related to a set of competencies which vary according to the organisation that has selected the report.
Mm-hmm. Can you mention a couple of examples of these competencies? You already said about the behaviour that people display, but what are typical competencies that are addressed by 360?
Well, typically you might have one on influencing, for example, or team working, and these would be fairly sort of standard ones. But if you were looking at a particular group like salespeople and so on, or finance people, it might be more specific in terms of the particular competencies you're looking at.
Right, and then it would be tailored to that particular organization. Yeah, right. And you mentioned before the importance of having that report debriefed and getting help with making sense of the data. What exactly is the role of the coach? How can the coach help people in their reactions to a report?
Well, first of all, the idea is to help them understand it and to make sense of it. And it helps if that's done in conjunction with a personality questionnaire, which helps them to understand themselves in relation to other people. So first of all, there's the understanding. And then there's the very important step of the development of an action in relation to it. So here you have your picture of how people see you at the moment. And the next step would be, so what do I do with that information? What do I want to do differently? What do I want to do if it's a strength? How do I make sure that I go on doing that or even do more of it? So an action plan that you develop with the coach would be a very important thing that the coach does with the person who has had the 360. And sort of more specifically, I think in terms of understanding, the coach can help people separate the kind of wood from the trees from the wood. I can never remember which way around it is.
Yeah.
So they don't react in a disproportionate way to, say, one particular person who's made a comment that maybe, I don't know, one person says that they lack empathy and so on. And then if they look at the rest of the report, the coach can help them do that. It's clear that this isn't a general perception of people, and therefore they shouldn't kind of spend much time worrying about it. The coach can also help them think about it in terms of, so how significant is that particular piece of feedback for the job that they do now, or equally important, the job that they're going to do next. And so, what should be focused on? And here we're talking about looking for themes. So we're looking for the important messages that are coming through, and we do that by looking at clusters. We look at the number of people who are saying the same thing, and if they are, that's probably quite an important theme. Equally, the coach can help the person understand that perhaps they're not coming over the same to different groups of people, because in that case they'll see a kind of spread of scores instead of clusters, and that might indicate that maybe they're not behaving in the same way with different individuals or indeed different groups. And kind of unpicking that together can be very illuminating for the person, as indeed can be the realization that intention doesn't always equal it. The intention that you have isn't necessarily going to be reflected in the impact, that the impact might be different from the intention.
Right. So you may display a particular behavior with the best intentions, but it doesn't get picked up in that way by the people who observe you. Is that what you're getting at?
Yes, indeed. Absolutely.
Yeah. So that's interesting, that question of perception versus intention, and also the truth. I mean, if I get such a report and I have it in front of me and 12 people or 15 people have filled it in, is that the truth about me? Is that who I am? How should I take that?
Well, of course, it's not the truth in any sort of sense of the one and only truth, but it is, of course, perceptions, and perceptions are really important because that's all we have to go on. And so if you don't agree with the perception, or you don't like the perceptions, then the idea is to try and think about how you might try to change these perceptions.
Yeah. Again, with the help of a coach, and presumably that would take the form of ultimately changing your behavior, because obviously you then want people to see something different in you and to rate you on that. So it can, in the best scenario, lead to a positive change in workplace behavior. Is that right?
Yes, indeed. And I think on the point of truth, there's also, it's important to remember that there's various factors involved. There's, in any piece of 360 feedback, there's the context to consider, the moment in time, which might have an impact on how you behave, the culture, including the culture of the organisation, the country, etc. And then there's also the factor of the raters, and the raters themselves come with their own personalities, and indeed their own what you could call rater behaviours. We all know that some people would never give a 5, or they would never give a 1 or a 2, and this can be from the best possible intentions, but they may not be using the whole range of the scales. And other people will deliberately use the whole range of the scales in order to make their feedback a bit more granular. So it's not absolute either, a 2 or a 5. It's in relation to the raters and indeed the context. Yeah,
yes. And also presumably to how long the raters have known you.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, one important, piece of advice that I would give people is to think very carefully about how you choose your raters. You want them to have had the opportunity to observe you in order to have some data on which to make their judgment in a way. Though, of course, you could argue that first impressions are also interesting sometimes to collect.
Yeah.
And you don't want to be choosing people that you get along very easily with, because sometimes the most interesting information that you get from the 360 comes from the people that you find more difficult to work with, and you're not quite sure why.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have any other piece of advice for someone who is thinking of doing a 360, or who has been asked to do a 360?
Yeah, I think one important piece of advice I would give is don't forget to thank people, because actually, particularly when you do it in a very committed way and you think about it, and you've spent hours maybe agonizing over what comments to make, it's really nice to know that the person has noticed they won't know if you've individually done it, but has appreciated the effort that has been put in by the raters. And so I think it's nice to thank people without indicating whether they filled it in or not, but thank them sort of in a more general way. Thanks to everybody for filling in the feedback, and maybe thinking about giving them, obviously not cited the actual report, but some headlines. So you could say, thank you very much for filling in the 360. What I was really pleased to hear is that everybody seems to think I've got a really collaborative approach. On the other hand, I'm picking up that I could sometimes be a bit more assertive, where I've got a view, which I think is important, but I'm maybe not getting it through. And that just gives people also the idea that you're going to do something with this data that they've all provided, and it's not going to just sort of sit on a shelf and gather dust.
Right.
So
right.
I think that's one piece of advice that I would give. And the other is that if there is something that really puzzles you, and sometimes there is, there's something that maybe even with the help of your coach going through it, you really don't get. Again, without putting anybody on the spot, I think you can just say, well, add to your sort of summary, well, there is, one piece of feedback that I'm struggling to understand. So if anybody can shed any light on it or give me any examples, I'd be really grateful.
Right. And if there's enough trust, I would imagine, in the workplace and or in your team, you could actually even bring that to your team and say, and just be open about it and say, this is what I did, these are the data, this is what I liked, this is what I think I have to work on, this is what I didn't get. Could you do something like that as almost like not a team building exercise, but a team event?
I think at least the what I'd call the headlines. Yeah. I think there's a balance between sharing it's the balance between about how much to share, because people don't want to ever feel that you know who said what, or that it isn't confidential. But I do think it's great to share with your team, and indeed anybody else you might think it's useful to share with. I do think it's useful to share the messages.
Yeah, good. So all in all, Jane, would you recommend that people do a 360?
Absolutely. Even if you're a little bit afraid of it, as you might be the first time. There are a lot of kind of questionnaires and surveys and so on out there. And as you know, I'm a particular fan of the MBTI, but not everybody is, and not everybody finds it quite so helpful or interesting to fill in personality surveys, for example. But I haven't ever met anybody who isn't interested in what other people think of them. And so doing a 360 is perhaps the one that most people would see the point of. And that if I had to choose like one kind of tool of this kind to be used to help people develop their leadership, I would say go for the 360.
Because it gives the viewpoint of many other people as opposed to just your own.
Yes.
Yeah. Excellent. Wonderful. This has been extremely helpful to get to know a little bit more about the 360. So thank you so much for your time today, and thank you for being on Let's Talk Leadership.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Britt.
Thank you, Jane. Be well.